you for joining me on another episode of Tu Esquina Filosofica, your philosophical corner. Today we're going to make a different move than what we did last time. Last time we covered Marxist, the German ideology, where he criticizes the hell out of the German idealist. Today we'll be going over one of the German idealists themselves, Arthur Schopenhauer. He's one of the great romantics, pessimist, and German idealist of his time. He was born in a middle-class merchant family. His parents had a business that they wanted him to take over, but he ended up becoming an academic. He was born in Danzig, Germany, in 1788, died in 1860. He was said to have been quite an interesting fellow. His character was a bit strange. He was rude at times and snobbish, but yet a lot of people said he was a great conversationalist. The guy can talk. He was also a connoisseur of food, music, and art, as we'll see later on in the video with the impact of art in his philosophy. And although he never married, he was said to have always been a ladies' man. A quote that defines his life pretty well, I think, comes from The World as Will and Idea. And it states that, although I have taught what sainthood is, I myself am no saint. So thank you for joining me from wherever you are, and I hope you enjoy this. So the main text we'll be going over today is his central text, The World as Will and Idea. He wrote it when he was 30, but he kept on working on it for the rest of his life. In The World as Will and Idea, he argues essentially that the world is made up of idea, but that in the process of intuitive learning, we realize that behind the idea, what we find is will. So he ends up arguing that the world is will. The world as idea refers first to the twofold nature of perception and then everything that flows afterwards from perception. The twofold nature of perception is essentially this. If we think of an object external to ourselves, for example, the sun, if we look directly at the sun, what we feel in our eyes is brightness. Now, the relation here is that the sun is the cause of the brightness you feel in your eye. But Schopenhauer says that in the level of awareness, we say and pretend to know and be aware of the brightness of the sun in itself, when we indeed are just really aware of the brightness effect the sun has on our eye. Thus, what is a property of the effect in our eye, we end up attributing it back to the cause, that being the sun. This is what he refers to as the double process of perception. Essentially, if an unknown X out there, let's say the sun, produces a change in an unknown Y, my body as it really is, and this change is experienced as bright or hot, what I end up doing is, instead of recognizing the fact that all I know is the relation of the cause and effect and its effect on my body, what I end up doing is attributing that to the sun or the initial cause. Schopenhauer held that behind the sense data are real entities, the nature and relation of which are quite different from those reported by sense data, and which are known in a totally different way. From this view on perception, he concluded two things. The first, which is that we cannot know the world through perception. The second, which says that we can know objects exist, though, for they are the causes of our perceptions. Thus, although perceptions cannot tell me anything about the object in itself, it can tell me about the effect the object causes the sense organs that are like mine. So far, this sounds like a softer version of Kantian epistemology, at least to me. The passage from effect to cause is what Schopenhauer calls knowledge or understanding. This passage to him is done by everyone, whether you're stupid or smart, which are the words he uses, in varying degrees. He compares a man who in the dark hears the noise of something moving and blames it on a ghost to Newton's discovery of gravity with the apple falling on his head. Both make the move of effect to cause. The difference is that the passage of the scientist, in this case, is incredibly more acute. He doesn't limit this passage to humans, though. He says that animals have this passage as well, except in a less acute way than even the stupidest human ever. Now, this does not mean that he attributes the capacity for reasoning to animals. He still believes that there is a unique capacity and distinction of man and animal, which is reason. Although he believes that this reasonable capacity distinction between man and animal is much more of a liability than an asset, really. Schopenhauer states that the essential characteristic of reason is conceptual. In his central text, The World as Will and Idea, he states that reason serves to take the objective connections which are immediately known by the understanding and make them permanent for thought. In essence, to him, reason is connected to the ability to retain, to jot down. This gives us the capacity for long-range planning and for essentially much of what we have in modern civilized society. But he states that the gains made by reasoning are more than upset by the cost, which he states are doubt, error, care, and sorrow entering into everyday human life. The essential error reason introduces, according to Schopenhauer, is that it falsifies the uniqueness and continuity of life. It seeks to identify things that are really different and to differentiate things that might actually be similar. Reason, to him, tries to impose distinctions on a reality that is really a continuum of differences in degrees. Take the example of blue. The concept references an infinite amount of so-called shades of blue, and thus we group all of these different colors under one category and call it blue. But some blues are closer to green than to what we conceive of as blue. Here we impose a conceptual dissimilarity on colors that may actually be quite similar. What he is proposing here is a radical kind of nominalism, at least in the level of the appearance. We'll see the difference in the level of the real afterwards. A radical kind of nominalism, in essence, the declassification of things as kinds of things and the acknowledgement of the uniqueness and oneness of each thing as such. Schopenhauer doesn't just limit his distaste of reasoning just to the level of cognitive incompetence. He stretches it out to the level of morality and practicality as well. He says that the concepts which help us weigh decisions consequentially remove our power to make them and make us fumble when we act. He also says that in terms of manners and social intercourse, that all that is attractive, and this is a quote, all that is attractive must not proceed from concepts, for if it does, we feel intention and are put out of line. He believed the same is true in terms of holiness and virtue. It doesn't stem from reason, rather it stems from intention. It stems from character. In his opinion, in his view, all that reason brought about in the moral sphere was the possibility for lying. In a sense, what Schopenhauer represents is a clear rift, a clear break with the ideas of his time, the ideas of the Enlightenment, the ideas of modernity, which really represent some sort of individualist rationality. He's in the field of the romantic who argues for a return to a pure state of humanity when things were based on intuition and character and the cognitive tools of rationality weren't as important. And this is something that not only we can see with his words, like with the actual things he's saying, but also in the structure itself. The structure of his writing is like the structure of the other romantics. It's not as structured necessarily. And as we'll see later on, some of the arguments, there's no way to even ask certain questions because the arguments come straight from intuition. So it's not only something that he argues for, but it is entrenched in the argument itself, in the form of the argument. Schopenhauer's second key point is that the world is will. So far, he has attacked perception as a means to knowledge and has recognized that science is at an even greater disconnect from reality as it tries to conceptualize perception. Luckily, perception in science is not the only faculty humans have. He states we also have an inner intuition of the intrinsic nature of reality. He states that this intuition discloses the inner nature of reality to be will. His starting point is the self. As we have mentioned, perception tells us about the effect the object being perceived had on our senses, but nothing about the object itself. And our body themselves are also just another perceptual object. He says that although we perceive ourselves as bodies living in spatio-temporal relations to other bodies, we intuit ourselves as will. From the intuition of ourselves as will, he concluded that the world itself is also will. Those things that come into contact with our senses are themselves will. Schopenhauer states that the meaning for which we seek will never be found if the investigator himself were nothing more than the pure knowing subject, a winged cherub without a body. But his knowledge, which is the necessary supporter of the whole world as idea, is yet always given through the medium of a body. His body is, for the pure knowing subject, an idea like any other idea, an object among objects. Nevertheless, he also experiences its movements and actions in an entirely different way. The answer to this riddle is given to the subject of knowledge who appears as an individual, and the answer is will. This and this alone gives him the key to his own existence, reveals to him the significance, shows him the inner mechanisms of his beings, of his actions, of his movements. The body is given in two entirely different ways to the subject of knowledge. It is given as an idea, an intelligent perception, and it is also given in a quite different way, as that which is immediately known to everyone, and that is signified by the word will. The act of will and the movement of the body are not two different objectively known things which the bond of causality unites. They are one and the same, but they are given in entirely different ways, immediately and then again in perception. The action of the body is nothing but the act of the will objectified, passed into perception. The whole body is nothing but the objectified will. Will becomes idea. In essence, Schopenhauer states that will and body are the same thing experienced in different ways. I think the questions here are, how does he know that the perceptual experience of the body and the intuitive experience of the will are the same thing? Is it not possible to imagine the same conditions and to conclude some sort of relation that is not one which categorizes both as the same? Is Schopenhauer here not making the same mistake of identification he blames reason for, except doing it at a larger scale? Schopenhauer doesn't seem to answer these questions, and part of it is because that big leap is made through intuition. It's not made through any rational sort of argumentation. And since it's made through intuition, something which he thought that everyone else would just recognize as soon as they read it, it's hard to kind of even ask a question about it, because it kind of makes you feel like, oh, I'm left out. I don't understand that intuition, or just the intuition is BS. The next step Schopenhauer takes is to expand this will that he intuits from being just a thing that people have to something that is actually behind the world as a whole. He does so through an argument from analogy. Once again, this analogy itself is based on some abstract intuition Schopenhauer imports on the world. Schopenhauer believed that this intuition of the acknowledgement of the world as will would be realized in all who read the text, the world as will and idea. He believed that through the recognition of the world as will that would come about when we read his text, people would realize the active participation in the community of feelings was connected to the actual real state of affairs in the world. Similarly to when someone reads a poem or sees an art piece and you feel like it expresses something that you already knew but weren't able to really conceptualize. The analogy itself is the analogy of the twilight, wherein although the essence of the light is the light itself, the sun, and what's left in the twilight is really everything else. He states that the highest form of will is human will, and that everything else essentially follows from that. Everything else, all the other wills that are in varying degrees, are that twilight that disappears when the highest form of light or the highest form of will disappears. We'll get to this later on when he talks about a sort of collective species suicide, but essentially he sees human beings as the highest degree of will and everything else as a lower kind of degree. So to sum up what we've seen from Schopenhauer so far, in essence, the point that he's making is that there is nothing to be known about reality outside of the fact that the world is will. What matters is not essentially what we know, but how we feel and how we act. Thus, as a romantic philosopher, instead of examining things like epistemology or metaphysics, he in a sense replaces it with art and religion. And that's what we'll see in the next couple sections, specifically in the one coming up on the nature of art. According to Schopenhauer, art has two major functions. The first, which is aesthetic. The aesthetic experience gives us a more adequate insight into reality than science ever could. Secondly, it's the strange nature of the aesthetic object that allows us to adopt it into a moral attitude. That is the second most important function of art. Hence, art has a cognitive function and an ethical function, which ultimately leads to religion. The essence of the cognitive function of aesthetics is that when we look at something aesthetically, we are able to grasp the essence or the inner nature of the thing. Although we can't conceptualize it, because doing so will be arriving at understanding, we can comprehend it in a different way. In an architecture, for example, we see the use of light and shadows. We see the interaction of light through the perception of an architectural structure, more unveiling of the true nature of light than any physics theory of light could provide. He extends to this gravity as well. He states that the understanding of gravity in the process of building something is much closer to the reality of gravity than any formula Newton came up with. Take the example of a color. How do you understand the color better? When you look at it, or when they tell you the amount of light, the sort of absorption, and the other properties that a given color has. The level of understanding that art brings about aesthetically, which is not necessarily conceptual understanding, is what really gives us, at least for a short term, an insight into the reality of the thing in itself. The question now is, if the world is will, what is the relationship of light and gravity, just to use the two things we talked about in the last example, in their manifestation? In essence, why do we have two different terms for light and gravity if they're both will? The answer he gives is that will manifests itself in different degrees, light and gravity in different degrees. But at the top of the manifestation of will, we have human beings, and below it we have, of course, different things, animals or inanimate objects, plants, and the varying degree of the manifestation of the will is how we see things differently, but really underlying is just all one manifestation of will. So what is the role of art then? As we spoke with, there's a cognitive and a moral function as well of art, but uh, he says that good art helps us transcend in understanding things as will. For example, when we look at people, he says that um, we stay in the level of perception. But when we look at a good portrait of someone, we somehow activate the potentiality to transcend into a real understanding of the nature of the person as will. He says that some people have the capacity to see this transcendence in, let's call it the thing in itself, and these are the people who are the artists. They depict those things in their art. Since they're able to see the transcendence of them as well, their art is made to help everyone else see that transcendence through the art. Schopenhauer believed that the aesthetic attitude produced by art is the moral function of art. Given that we are really will, even what seems to be an objective cognitive attitude is really never a dispassionate contemplation like the rationalists believed. Cognitive functions are always subjected to the will. He stated that knowledge is completely subjected to the will. Only through its relation to his body is the object interesting to the individual, related to the will. Therefore, the knowledge which is subject to the will knows nothing further of the objects than their relations. In essence, cognitive functions are very well slaves of the will, a will which examines only those things it is interested in or it can use. This last point that Schopenhauer makes reminds me of a concept of a philosopher who came around 100 years after, Martin Heidegger. And the concept is equiprimordialness. In a sense, what this means is that we look at the things around us not as just things in itself, but as means to an end, as equipment in our projects. And this is the same thing that Schopenhauer is saying, or at least a very similar point, which is that the only things we really care to focus on are the things that interest us. Schopenhauer reminds us that will, although it might be conscious at the human level, is essentially blind. It is in a constant, pointless struggle. It doesn't head anywhere specifically. There's never a specific destination for it. It desires while not knowing what it actually wants. And until we obtain something, we are unhappy. But then when we obtain it, we are bored. Our will relentlessly desires without ever achieving actual fulfillment. This reminds me very much of Zizek's Lacanian observation in the movie The Pervert's Guide to Ideology, where in the scene where he is talking about Coca-Cola, he states the paradox of a desire. A desire is never really what we conceive we're desiring. There is always an extra metaphysical level that's actually the object of desire, that when we lose that, even though we're unconscious of it, somehow we lose the desire. When the Coke stops being hot, it's no longer Coke, the great drink. It's shit, essentially. That's the word he uses. So it's this Lacanian interpretation, I think it fits in nicely here, because it's our will never actually desires something in specific. As Schopenhauer says, we're constantly desiring but never fulfilling those desires. And that itself is the point that Zizek is trying to make and that Lacan makes, which is that it's never a desire for an object or something external. It's really just a desire for desiring itself. In essence, to Schopenhauer, everything is enslaved to the will. The only possible moment when those chains can loosen up are in the moments of aesthetic attitudes. In these moments, we are not trying to classify, identify, or group things into our boxes of understanding. Rather, we just feel the experience, and in that moment, the grip that the will has on our freedom is loosened. This is reflected in the following quote. Schopenhauer states, "If, raised by the power of the mind, a man relinquishes the common way of looking at things, gives up tracing their relations to each other, the final goal of which is always a relation of his will, if he thus ceases to consider the where, the when, the why, and the whither of things, and looks simply and solely at the will, at the what, if further he does not allow abstract thought, the concepts of the reason to take possession of his consciousness, but instead of this lets his whole consciousness be filled with the quiet contemplation of natural objects actually present, whether a landscape, a tree, a mountain, a building, or whatever it may be, inasmuch as he loses himself in this object, to use a German idiom, forgets even his individuality, his will, the only continuous to exist as the pure subject, the clear mirror of the object, so that it is as if the object alone were there, without anyone to perceive it. Then he who is sunk into this perception is no longer individual, for in such perception the individual has lost himself, but he is pure, will-less, painless, timeless, subject of knowledge." From this basically constant enslavement of the will might arise the notion of escape through death. But Schopenhauer states that to commit suicide is not to defeat the will, rather to let it triumph over us. The idea that we escape this miserable enslavement of the will through ending our lives is basically on the assumption that our phenomenal self and its phenomenal life is real. But life, he says, as objects in space and time and in causal relations with their environment, is merely the appearance of the will. All events of individuals, including their deaths and their life, are merely incidents in this phenomenal flow. This means that killing ourselves doesn't end the cycle, rather just eliminates a small segment of it, which is the segment of appearance. Schopenhauer states that will is the thing in itself, the inner content, the essence of the world. Life, the visible world, the phenomenon, is only the mirror of the will. It is true that we see the individual come into being and pass away, but the individual is only phenomenal. Birth and death belong merely to the phenomenon of will, this to life. The form of this phenomenon is time, space, and causality, and by no means of these individuations which carries with it that the individual must come into being and pass away. But this is no more affects the will to live, of whose manifestation the individual is, as it were only a particular example or specimen, than the death of an individual injures the whole of nature. The man who has comprehended and retained this point of view may well console himself when contemplating his own death and that of his friends by turning his life to the immortal life of nature, which he himself is. Above all things, we must distinctly recognize that the form of the phenomena of the will, the form of life or reality, is really only the present, not the future or the past. The latter are only in the conception, exist only in the connection of knowledge. Our own past, the most recent part of it, and even yesterday, is now no more than an empty dream of the fantasy, and such is that the past of millions who have lived before us. What is the will, of which life is the mirror, and knowledge free from will, which beholds it clearly in that mirror. Therefore, if a man fears death as his annihilation, it is just as if he were to think that the sun cries out in the evening, "Woe is me, for I go down into eternal night." Life is assured to the will to live. The form of life is an endless present. No matter how the individuals, the phenomena of the idea, arise and pass away in time like fleeting dreams. Thus, even already suicide appears to us as a vain and therefore a foolish action. In essence, it is this realization of the appearance condition of life, of the multiplicity of self and private interest as an illusion, that points to the real solution. Knowledge of this illusion acts as a quieter of the will, as a suppressor of the will, in the same way that art acted in that manner, except in the acknowledgement of the illusion, you get that same quieting or suppressing of the will, of the enslavement of the will that you get with art, except with more permanence. In this kind of knowledge of the illusion, the will suppresses itself, and it is this, not suicide, that is the true denial of the will. Insofar as morality is concerned, he believed the various types of conducts to be a result in the variation of the degree of man's realization of the truth of the world, which of course is that everything is will. He states that the first advance that moves beyond the Hobbesian egoist is the recognition that he is not the only will, that there are other wills and desires. In this step, man, although still imposing his will, focuses on justice and the imposition of his will without deterring the will of the other. The next step, he believed, is the one that is taught in the Hindu tradition, which is the realization of the total oneness of life. This comes when we realize that differences are just phenomenal, and that in the level of the real, we are all essentially one. Schopenhauer stated that never has a myth entered, and never will one enter, more closely into the philosophical truth which is attainable to so few than this primitive doctrine of the noblest and most ancient nation. How inferior, then, is the Christian religion, how ridiculous to seek to convert the Hindus. In India, our religions will never take root. The ancient wisdom of the human race will not be displaced by what happened in Galilee. On the contrary, Indian philosophy streams back to Europe and will prove a fundamental change in our knowledge and thought. In essence, what we have seen here with Schopenhauer is quite a transformation from that first sense of radical nominalism to now everything being one. But has it really been a transformation, or has he just been unveiling the different layers of reality? So what we have then is the continuation of the nominalism, but it's now in a layer that he describes as the layer of appearance. So we have nominalism and appearance, but in the more profound layer of the real, we have monism, we have the one, which is will. Schopenhauer states that at this level, when a man no longer makes the egotistical distinction between his person and that of others, but takes as much interest in the sufferings of other individuals as his own, and therefore is not only benevolent in the highest degree, but even ready to sacrifice his own individuality whenever such a sacrifice will save a number of people, then it clearly follows that such a man who recognizes in all beings his own innermost and true self must also regard the infinite suffering of all suffering being as his own, and take on himself the pain of the whole world. Knowledge of the whole, of the nature of the thing in itself which has been described, becomes a quieter of all and every volition. The will now turns away from life. It now shudders at the pleasures in which it recognizes the assertion of life. Man now attains to the state of voluntary renunciation, resignation, true indifference, and perfect willlessness. The phenomenon by which this change is marked is the transition from virtue to asceticism. There arises within him a horror of the nature of which his own phenomenal existence is an expression. The will to live, the kernel of the inner nature of the world, which is recognized as full misery. He therefore disowns this nature which appears in him and is already expressed through his body, and his action gives the lie to his phenomenal existence and appears in open contradiction to it. His body, healthy and strong, expresses through the genitals the sexual impulses, but he denies the will and gives the lie to the body. He desires no sexual gratification under any condition. Voluntary and complete chastity is the first step in asceticism, or the denial of the will to live. Nature, always true and naive, declares that if this maxim became universal, the human race would die out. And I think I may assume, in accordance with what was said about the connection of all manifestations of will, that with its highest manifestation, the weaker reflection of it will also pass away, as the twilight vanishes along with the full light. With the entire abolition of knowledge, the rest of the world would have itself vanished into nothing, for without a subject there is no object. The two fundamental problems I find here are, first, what would be the difference between the individual suicide that he condemns and then this sort of collective suicide of, at the end of the day, they're both in the level of appearance. And then the second problem I see is that how would the extinction of the human species entail the vanishing of all will? I know he uses the analogy of the twilight disappearing when the light disappears, but is it not possible to imagine the continuation of all will if the highest form of it, according to him, is gone? Um, these questions themselves seem kind of pointless to be asked, because it's just the fact that his philosophical foundation is just sheer intuition and feeling, but I think it's still worthy of mentioning. Schopenhauer then goes on to state that what I have here described with feeble tongue and only in general terms is no philosophical fable invented by myself and only of today. No, it was the inviolable life of so many saints and beautiful souls among Christians, and still more among Hindus and Buddhists, and also among the believers of other religions. However different were the dogmas impressed on their reason, the same inward, direct, intuitive knowledge from which alone all virtue and holiness proceeds expressed itself in precisely the same way in the conduct of life. For here also the great distinctions between intuitive and abstract knowledge shows itself. There is a wide gulf between the two which can only be crossed by the aid of philosophy. As regards the knowledge of the nature of the world, intuitively or in concreto, every man is really conscious of all philosophical truths. But to bring it back to abstract knowledge, to reflection, is the work of philosophy, which neither ought nor is able to do more than this. He then goes on to say that, thus, it may be that the inner nature of holiness, self-renunciation, mortification of our own will, asceticism, is here for the first time expressed abstractly and free from all mythical elements as denial of the will to live, appearing after the complete knowledge of its own nature has become a quieter of all volitions. On the other hand, it has been known directly and realized in practice by saints and ascetics who had all the same inward knowledge, though they used different language with regards to it, according to the dogmas which their reason had accepted, and in consequence of which an Indian, a Christian, or a Lama saint must each give a different account of his conduct, which is, however, of no importance as regards to the fact. A saint may be full of the absurdest superstition, or on the contrary, he may be a great philosopher. It is all the same. His conduct alone certifies that he is a saint, for in a moral regard, it proceeds from knowledge of the world and its nature, which is not only abstractly but intuitively and directly apprehended, and is only expressed by him in any dogmas of the satisfaction of his reaction. To repeat the whole of nature of the world abstractly, universally, and distinctly in concepts, and thus to store up, as it were, a reflected image of it in permanent concepts, always at the command of reason, this and nothing else is philosophy. In essence, Schopenhauer here is making two fundamental points. The first is on the role of philosophy as a bridge from the intuitive, which is, although incommunicable, true, to the abstract, which, although false, is communicable. A bridge his philosophy, he believes, has created in terms of the nature of all things as will, and asceticism as the quieting of the enslavement of this will. This, in a sense, leaves philosophy in a weird position. First question to be asked is, if philosophy is conceptual and abstract, what makes it different than the other conceptual and abstract fields he depreciates? The second question is, if truth and goodness comes from intuitive conduct, then what even is the need for philosophy as a bridge if the mysticism of religion would have already been with the truth in their hands? The second point is that in order to combat this enslavement of the will with permanence and to quiet it, the only way to do it is through asceticism. This is something he believes in the level of conduct has been preached by all religions, regardless of how different, philosophical or superstitious, the stories or concepts surrounding it are. Now that we have concluded with Schopenhauer's philosophy, I think that although there seems to be quite a few paradoxes within his philosophy, as well as some unanswerable questions given the nature of the philosophical foundations he builds his philosophy on, I think there's still a few things to take away of value from Schopenhauer. So the next few comments I will make, the first two are the biggest takeaways that I derive from Schopenhauer in his context. And then I will give you the takeaway for our more present context. So, first, one of the things that we have to realize is that he is one of the first philosophers of the West to attempt a philosophical synthesis of the Oriental and Western thought. And this is something that ought to be valued in itself. The second point, I'm going to divide into two different answers. The first one, I'll give you a general philosophical answer. The second answer is going to come more through my Marxist framework. This first answer is that an important thing to notice is that he does kind of represent a radical shift from the Enlightenment thought of his time. The Enlightenment valued individualist rationalism, and through his romanticist rejection of rationality, through his nominalism in the layer of appearance and monism in the layer of the real, he represents a reaction to the Enlightenment thought that appears, at least to me, as a refreshment of a global ancient philosophy in an era of Eurocentrism, individualism, and rationalism. So, this point is simply that although it can be taken as slightly uh, reactionary, but on a global scale, as he, um, like I said from the previous point, kind of synthesizes Eastern and Western thought in his philosophy, uh, it's still a move away from what was going on in through the Age of Enlightenment, and it ought to be valued for that. Now, as a philosopher, one of the things that I consider interesting to the critique of this level that a Marxist would call ideology or superstructure um, is the different layers of critiques, the different types of critiques, and I have labeled three different types of critiques in my own philosophy. There's the cynical reaction to ideology, which is not really a critique. It understands ideology as it is, but still it understands ideology as the distortive force, but still acts as if it doesn't. Then there's the synthetic critique, which is what I believe he's making here. I will let you know what that is just in a second. And then there's the pure ideological critique, which gets at the essence of the ideology is trying to critique. Now, why do I label Schopenhauer's philosophy as a synthetic critique of the ideology of enlightenment? Well, because what is the essence of the Enlightenment? If we go back to the last video I made on Marx's the German ideology, the essence of all thought is in material and not just a cheap form of materialism or material reductivism, but of the productive relations at play. The ideological sphere is pretty much nothing more than just the ideal ideas to withhold the productive relations of a given time. So the Age of Enlightenment represents the age of the development of the productive forces of capitalism, and the ideas themselves are there along with the development of production in order to create the ideological superstructure to hold that material basis up. So if we want a actual substantial critique of the ideology, we have to attack that base. So one of the things that I see Schopenhauer doing is recognizing the harsh conditions of reality, but then instead of trying to attack the base or change those conditions, he he ends up in the level of asceticism, in the level of the removal of essentially life, because life to him and the world is the will to live. And this is something that I think contextually has tremendous importance. Take the example of climate change. There's the vast majority of critiques that we get are synthetic critiques. We see it with sort of green capitalism, with the movement to recycle, um, the movement to eat vegan or whatever. Now there's the paradox, not the paradox, but the thing about all these synthetic critiques is that they always carry with them a small amount of truth. It is true that if the single most contribution you can make as an individual to lower your emissions is being vegan. That's true. But to promote that as a solution to climate change when we know that it's, for example, 100 companies that are emitting 70% of emissions and that 90 something percent of emission comes from just the sheer productive level of capitalism, to input the responsibility on the individual is a synthetic critique. It is a critique that benefits the system, that keeps it going, and that alienates the responsibility from the system to the individual. I see Schopenhauer making the same mistake by escaping the harsh material conditions of life, not through fighting to change the harsh material conditions of life, but through going into the level of self-denial, going into the level of isolation. That that itself is is a pseudo escape. You don't ever really escape because you don't ever change the conditions that put you in a situation that made you want to escape in the first place. And thus, I see the philosophy that Schopenhauer is developing, although it's at the surface a rift from the Enlightenment thought, it is still working within the Enlightenment thought. It is a critique that is not substantial enough to represent an actual threat to the thought of the Enlightenment. And because of that condition that it holds, it's actually a pocket of critique within the Enlightenment thought. What do I mean by a pocket of critique? It is a critique that, since it is recognized as not substantial, it is a critique the Enlightenment itself prefers one to go into if they ought to critique the Enlightenment thought. Because, like I said, it's not substantial enough to overthrow it. It is a critique that would never be strong enough. So if you want an opponent, you want one that's not going to beat you. And that's what essentially I feel like his philosophy is. His philosophy is never going to actually transcend the Enlightenment thought, at least in my view. Because, like I said, it doesn't get to the essence of what it is that brings about the Enlightenment thought. So that's just a quick Marxist interpretation of this notion that somehow Schopenhauer transcends. I don't think he transcends. He represents a critique, but a synthetic one that is within the system of the Enlightenment thought. Now, from Schopenhauer's philosophy, besides this critique of it as synthetic, what can we take away? Well, I believe that a major takeaway for our context is the appreciation of the illusion of differences in the level of appearance and the reality of the radical oneness in the level of the real. Now, we don't have to be radical nominalist in the sphere of phenomena to recognize the apparent uniqueness in all things, whether we look at it at the level of form or just strictly matter. But we also ought to recognize as well the unifying oneness of all things, of all existing things as existing things. In essence, the recognition of our apparent differences, but our essential sameness. I think that's something that is definitely valuable in our context. Now, this is how I want to conclude the video. I want to thank you all for watching. Please tell me if you disagree with anything in the comments, or if you don't, or just tell me how you feel in the comment. Tell me if you like the video structure. I tried to show myself talking a little more and mix it up with quotes, among other things. Tell me how I can improve these videos. Tell me if there's anyone that you would like me to do, any specific philosopher or current of thought. And yeah, you can follow us now on Instagram and Facebook, the same name, Tu Esquina Filosófica. Like us on Facebook, follow us on Instagram. I've been trying to post there a few times a week, just some quotes and other things. So thank you for watching, and like, comment, subscribe, share it with your friends who like philosophy, and stay safe. There's a virus going around. It's pretty scary. It's now is the right time to read some existentialism. So grab your Camus, grab your Sartre, your de Beauvoir, and go at it. Grab some Kierkegaard and go at it. So peace and stay safe.